I used to rule the world. Hi everyone, welcome to History on Trial and Science on Trial. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. We're going to be quickly addressing the naming of this new disease and how this new disease name actually correlates with that which would be understood as the King James virus, the Royal Crown King James disease. It's important to point out as we go forward with this very quick discussion, the fact that disease names are supposed to be given in a way that do not induce stigma. And one of the ways that stigma might be induced related to the naming of a disease is to use things like the names of people or the names of social groups or locations or occupations, animals, food, and also fear-inducing words. And so there are a number of disease names that have fallen under that particular umbrella with all of these different things. And you can see some of them on the screen, even starting with Ebola and swine flu and Spanish flu. And we have a similar dynamic going on in the current situation. It may not be completely obvious to those who are considered English speakers. However, when you use the words for this current situation in other languages, you come up with something very specific, something other than just these simple acronyms that many people believe have been created. Now, before we go into the specifics related to the etymologies and the history behind all of this, we're just going to do a quick overview, and you can see it on the screen so that you know where we are going with this. And so you can see the actual words that comprise this current situation. And so one word is SARS. And that word, even though it appears to be nothing specific in terms of the English language, people wouldn't just automatically think of anything. It actually has meaning in other languages. And so if someone is a speaker of another language and they see this same word, they may understand it in a different way. And one language is related to Hebrew. And so SARS, this relates to the idea of ruler, chief, prince, lord. And you can also see for Hebrew 6862, SAR, you can see it means adversary, foe, enemy, oppressor, distress, and affliction. You also see another understanding of SAR, which is at Hebrew 5620, and we're talking about Strong's Concordance. And you can see it means resentful, stubborn, sullen, and rebellious. It's also important to note that SAR with that TSAR is also understood as ruler when you're talking about groups of people in Eastern Europe. And so you would think about like Tsar Nicholas. And not only do you have this SAR meaning something in the Hebrew, you also have the word kov meaning something very, very specific in Hebrew. And it translates to Jacob. In other words, also James. And this comes about based upon something we've talked about before when we were talking about the Iberians and Ivorians and that betacism dynamic where the V and the B are interchangeable. Well, that applies here also. And so you also see where you have COVID, and that also equals, if you're going to look at it as coronavirus, the COVID, you also have a dynamic where it is saying basically Jacob or James virus. And then down below, you see the COVID. And when you add that D is for disease. And basically, you just have a translation of Jacob or James virus disease. And so that's why it's very, very important to understand that when people are using acronyms, it may not have a significant meaning in your language. However, in another language, it might have very significant meaning. And the acronym that's being used may be extremely offensive on many levels. Not only do you have the unusual dynamic of SAR, meaning ruler, everything about this current situation and the naming seems to involve or revolve around this idea of royalty or monarchy. And so kings and princes and rulers, and you even have corona, which translates to crown. And so you can also see here, and this comes again out of Strong's Concordance, where this word relates to this idea of a royal crown. And there is a specific reference to it in what would be considered Revelation. And so that would be in the New Testament of the Bible. And it's at the end of the book. And so you can see here that it's related specifically to this coalition that's mentioned in Revelation 13:1. And so it's really related to this idea of kingship. And so you have this virus that has a name that is related to this right here, this idea of a royal crown. And here you can see for yourself how the word sar breaks down in terms of etymology, and you can see it in the Hebrew, and you can see specifically that it relates to this idea of chieftain, a ruler, an official, a prince, a person of royalty. And here it goes on to give additional meanings related to sar. And so it's really talking about sort of a head, a commander in chief, a king, a prince, a ruler. And this is an extensive transliteration. You can see all of the different variations of this particular word down below. And you can see here that it relates back to this word sarar, and this also means to be or act as a prince, to rule. And you see additional transliteration information related to that sarar. Now we're going to look at how Jacob and Cove are actually related. And so again, at first blush, they do not appear to be related. They don't appear to be the same word, but you will see how they are the same word, and that Cove is just a derivative or a shortened version of Jacob. And you can see here the English wording of Jacob with the JACOB, and then you can see the translation into Latin, and you have the IACOBUS. And now we're going to look at the Greek translation. So again, you see the JACOB in English, but then when you get into the Greek translation, it looks very similar to the Latin translation, but there is a change, and that change is related to that betacism dynamic. And so you can see down at the bottom that IAKOVOS. And so you see that interchangeable C and K, and then that interchangeable B and V. And then not only do you have the translation of Jacob going into the Greek and the Latin, but you can also see how in another language where you have that IAKOV in Romanian language, you can see that it translates in Latin into James. And here you can see multiple dynamics with the betacism and those interchangeable letters. And so you can see here when you look at COVI or COVI, you can see that it is translating into the Greek as KOBI. And so you can see the interchangeable C and the K, and then you see the interchangeable B and V. Now, not only do you have this dynamic of the IACOV translating into James, and so by now you know that James and Jacob are also interchangeable variations of each other, but you also have this interesting dynamic with the Cove in another language that translates into the Hebrew with the symbol that you see. Now, that symbol actually looks like it might be Yiddish, but it's translating into the Hebrew in this particular format. And here you can see how James and Iakov translate back and forth related to Romanian language and the Hebrew and Latin. And again, here you can see this relationship between IAKOV and James when you go from Romanian into Greek. And so you can see down at the bottom it's James, and so that T is silent. So not only do you have this dynamic of Cove being a derivative of Jacob or James, you have the shortened version, or having it be Covey and Kobe, which also are derivatives or shortened versions of James. You also have this interesting dynamic where Cove actually in another language translates to God, G-O-D. And this occurs when tracing English back to Hebrew. Now, there is a theory that English actually has its roots in Hebrew, and many people don't talk about that, but there is an argument for that. And so when that takes place, this translation over time, you see that the C and the G are interchangeable, almost like that beta-sism dynamic. And so G was introduced in Old Latin as C. And so you have these letters being used to replace each other. So you have change and chance actually could be basically the same word. And so here you can see the translation of the COV into the Hebrew, and you see that symbol. You also see that symbol when it's translated out of Hebrew into Latin. You have Deus. And so that is basically God. Not only do you have that symbol translating into God in the Latin, you also have the same symbol translating into this idea of God in the Greek. And finally, you can see that the symbol, which means cove in one language and translates into these variations of God in old languages such as Greek and Latin, you can see here that this symbol also translates into God in English. And so what we have here is the naming of a disease in current times that has a translation that may be offensive to many people. And so to identify something as a God disease or a God virus or a Jacob virus or a James virus or a King James or Chief James or King Jacob or Chief Jacob disease, this can be very problematic and it can be very offensive. It can also be understood as having some racial overtones because you are talking about perhaps an entire group of people in terms of ethnicity. You also have the possibility that those who are understood as Jacobites might also be included in this naming with this disease. And so for these reasons, it's very important when scientists are naming that they take care to make sure that when they are coming up with acronyms and mnemonics and things like that, that they make sure that it doesn't translate into something that WHO identified as being offensive, and so that it doesn't identify a disease according to a group of people or the name of a person or a place or an occupation. And so this is very important because right now you have a disease that translates into basically the King James virus disease or the King Jacob or the Prince Jacob or Chief Jacob virus disease. And in some instances, it looks like King of God disease. And so this can be problematic. And so again, there needs to be care taken with this naming, because if that care is not taken, you have a dynamic that can be offensive to a number of people. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon. And for those of you who are celebrating your Sabbath, happy Sabbath.